Bob Woodward joins us. Hello.
Morning.
Welcome.
Thank you.
This is your new book?
Yes.
When did you first decide that you wanted to take a kind of a chronological and thematic view at the impact of Watergate?
I think after the '96 election, and it was pretty clear that Clinton was entangled in scandal, and of course this is well before the Lewinsky saga broke, and it was obvious when you looked at it from 1996 that all of the presidents since Nixon had one scandal or investigation that altered how they functioned as president and had a deep impact on them personally.
But for you, when was that?
In '96.
In '96?
In '96, about 3 years ago.
And did you ever think that it would come out in this form, though? I mean, was this always your plan?
It was, but as the Lewinsky scandal grew, the portion of the book that's devoted to Clinton grew. So it's 60% of the book almost.
I was going to ask you, because to show our viewers a little bit about, so that they can see this. This part is, well, actually, let me start with this part. This part is the part on the rest of the presidents, and this is the part on just President Clinton.
Right.
Is that substantively the most important part?
Well, Clinton wins the prize in the sense of Whitewater went on for so long. It had so many shifting centers of attention, FBI files, the travel office firing, the Whitewater land deal itself. There was a period in the Ken Starr investigation where it focused on Mrs. Clinton, and then it shifted to Clinton, and then it grew into the Lewinsky scandal in one of these odd collisions of history where the Paula Jones case changed into the Whitewater Lewinsky investigation.
Before we get to our first call, walk through with us the main issues for each of these presidents in their impact from Watergate. First, Gerald Ford.
Well, Ford was an accident to a certain extent. He was a Michigan congressman and then 10 months later was president. He had not experienced a national campaign in any sense. He had been House Minority Leader, been in the House about 26 years, but he really wasn't ready for the presidency in many ways, even by his own acknowledgement. The Nixon pardon is the event that really defined and, in a sense, compromised his presidency. It was a month after he took office. He appeared on television even earlier on a Sunday morning and announced that he was giving Nixon a pardon, and I think that the public collectively said, hey, wait a minute, why him? What's going on here? Is there a deal? Ford always denied there was a deal, but when you look into this, you see that Ford and his aides believe a deal was offered.
Now, a lot of the pictures from your book are people that people know from history, and yet there are some here that are not household names. Who's this gentleman?
Well, that's Jack Marsh, who was one of Ford's closest aides, a former congressman, who, when it came to the issue of Ford going to the Hill to testify on the pardon and whether there was a deal, Jack Marsh went up. Now here he's working for a Republican president, went up to see the Democratic Speaker of the House, then Carl Albert, and Albert said, I mean, this is 1974, 25 years ago, and Albert said, look, have Jerry Ford come up. He won't be hurt if he testifies. It's very important that Jerry Ford succeed as president, so there was a kind of civility even in the months after Nixon's resignation that you certainly would not see now in American politics.
Who's this?
Bryce Harlow, kind of one of the old wise men of the Republican Party, who was called in to advise Ford on what had happened. Ford met with Haig before he assumed the presidency, and Haig laid out a lot of pardon options.
And who's this?
This is Benton Becker, who, a longtime Ford friend, a lawyer who was brought in after Ford became president to go negotiate the pardon arrangement and some of the details with Richard Nixon and his lawyer.
As you look back at it now historically, what kind of impact did that pardon have on the rest of Mr. Ford's presidency?
Well, I think I don't mean to extract the title of the book, but it cast a shadow on his presidency in a very real way. He was never able to explain it fully. I think he did not make a literal deal, but I think the naivete he brought to the presidency in that initial period, to think he could do this without explaining it, to think that Gerald Ford could really grant the pardon to Nixon without getting Nixon to acknowledge that he had committed crimes. If he had done that, in a sense, it would have ended somewhat of a historical debate that Nixon tried to get going for the next 20 years.
Bob Woodward will be with us for 90 minutes. We're going to be taking a look at these 5 different presidents and what he calls Shadow, the 5 presidents, and the legacy of Watergate. Our first call for Bob Woodward is from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Hello.
Yes, hello, Mr. Woodward.
Hi, how are you?
Fine. I want to say I've appreciated your work for many, many years and followed it with great interest. I have a question about an ethical question about if you were under a contractual agreement with a newspaper or network or cable TV shows, and as a newspaperman, and you had information, let's say regarding the Clinton problems, did you have any obligations to report that then, or hold on to that information until you were writing a book? And also, sir,
that's a good question.
Yeah, I'd like to know if the legacy also has to do with the wives of Presidents X and President Clinton now. And if that is the case, how will President Clinton be affected by Mrs. Clinton's run for the Senate if she in fact does that? And how will she explain, or what do you know is her explanation now for, let's say, the commodities trade? I'm really interested in your question, and I appreciate it, sir. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, on the question, if in the course of reporting this book I learn that something that really should be in the newspaper, because I'm working for the Washington Post, my publishers at Simon & Schuster fully understand if something's news, it should be put in the paper. And as I recount in the book, in August of last year, when I learned that President Clinton was going to change his story from total denial on any relationship with Monica Lewinsky to the position that he had an inappropriate, intimate relationship with her, I wrote that story and it ran in the Washington Post. The question about
the wives,
the wives and the first ladies, there is a lot about Mrs. Clinton in this book, and certainly because she was the chief investor for the family and really knew more about the Whitewater land deal than her husband, because questions have been raised about her in terms of the FBI files, in terms of the travel office. She got these multiple spotlights of investigations on her, and I attempt to chart in detail the emotional impact on her, and it was tremendous. I mean, she was crying, she was in despair, she was feeling that the investigations made it so bad that she could not go to Congress and testify herself to show that she cared about the people who were being dragged before the Senate committee.
Any one former First Lady that you would pull out to talk about the impact?
Well, I think it had the most impact on Hillary Clinton by far. I think Nancy Reagan, it helps in life for anyone to have a paranoid spouse. And Nancy Reagan was Ronald Reagan's long-range radar system. And she functioned very well and is outlined in the book. She realized in the Iran-Contra investigation and scandal that it was Bill Casey, the CIA director, who she wanted to put as much distance between herself and, between her husband and Bill Casey, and she worked very aggressively, which is charted out here. And she charted some of it in her own book, as did Don Regan, the White House Chief of Staff, to get Casey out. because he was the symbol of the problem, if not the origin of it.
Lodi, California, you're next for Bob Woodward. Hello.
Hi. I got 3 questions to ask. 1, how do you start writing? 2, how do you overcome writer's block? And 3, where exactly do you write?
That's it. How do you start writing? You set a date, and I always think it's best to do an early draft to get it down, to see how it looks, to see how it reads, to see what the gaps are. I wrote this book out in Edgewater, Maryland, where my wife and daughter and I have a home where we normally only go on weekends, but we lived there for 6 months. And I got up at sometimes 5 a.m. and set the writing goal of 10 pages a day. If it took 4 hours, 6 hours, fine. If it took 12 hours, I would not leave the computer until I had done my 10 pages.
Gee, I'd love to do a statistic here. So at 500 and...
I'm sorry, she had asked the question about writer's block.
Do you ever get writer's block?
I think writer's block, particularly if you're doing a nonfiction book or writing something that happened, I mean, you can always start it because you always know something. And some of this writing is a matter of getting it down and then trying to perfect it and add to it and check things.
What's the atmosphere of where you write within that house in Edgewater?
Well, I had a separate guest house to work in, and so it's overlooking the water and a beautiful, distracting place to write.
You use music? Do you write in silence?
Sometimes music, classical music, sometimes silence. The key for me is to get going early.
In the day?
In the day, before phone calls, before even looking at the newspaper, and from 5 a.m. to 8 or 9 a.m. often you can get half or a third or a really good start on what you want to get done that day, and then it's much easier.
Bluffton, Indiana, you're next. Hello.
Hi.
Morning.
The issue in all of this for me was I believe that President Clinton committed a felony while in office. And I was raised to believe that a felony was a really, really bad thing. It can send you to prison and remove you from your home, remove you from society. And it always bothered me that he was allowed to stay in office in the White House after committing a felony. Also, the second issue that really bothered me was the intimidation of women, threats, and all of that. And I think there was a lack of investigative reporting in that area.
Thanks, Indiana.
Okay, first of all, the question of whether President Clinton committed a felony technically remains open. It's Ken Starr who's investigating that, as the independent counsel has the authority to bring criminal charges or not, and there is every indication that he is not going to do that. The president's lawyers argued in his Senate trial, in the end successfully, that in the president's grand jury testimony he did not lie because he changed his story. He said he had this inappropriate, intimate relationship with Monica Lewinsky. On the question of obstruction of justice, there were, in the end, not only the 45 Democratic senators who voted to acquit Clinton, but 10 Republicans joined them on the belief that, I'm sorry, that it was the other way around. It was 10 on the perjury charge, and 5 Republicans joined all of the Democrats on the obstruction of justice charge.
And her question about treatment of women.
Well, I think there was a lot of investigative reporting. The president's defenders would argue that there was too much. I think when you look at the way the president dealt with some of these women, it is not only inappropriate, but the way he dealt with Monica Lewinsky was abhorrent to anyone. I mean, the idea that a president, even though she initiated it, there is, he just, a big red light should have gone on, no matter what his impulses might have been, that just said no.
Bob Woodward's publisher for his new book, Shadow, is Simon & Schuster. Simon & Schuster also has this book that came out this year. What is it?
That's right. Well, they have started these, what they call the Simon & Schuster Classic Editions, which are books they previously published. And this is All the President's Men, the book that Carl Bernstein and I co-authored, which came out 25 years ago, recounting the Washington Post role in covering that story. And it's a journalism story, and it was made into a movie, and it's in a way, partially, I think a lot of people have their understanding of Watergate from that book and that movie.
Do you, are there plans to do any kinds of special programs or discussions with you and Carl Bernstein and people on this 25th anniversary year?
Well, it turns out that in August of this year, in a couple of months, will be the 25th anniversary of Nixon's resignation. I don't know, but part of doing the book Shadow was to say, okay, let's look at that era, that period of history from Nixon's resignation to the present, and say what happened. There have been all these books about the legacy of Vietnam, which certainly had a tremendous impact on this country. I would argue that Watergate likewise had a tremendous impact on the country, and certainly the presidency.
Rockville, Maryland, you're next. Hello.
Hello. Hi, Mr. Woodward.
Hi.
My comment is that it seems to me that someone should write a book, Shadow, the media and the presidents after Watergate. Because when the media destroyed Nixon and it became the first estate, and the media's been losing credibility ever since then.
Okay, let me try to address that. First of all, the media didn't destroy Nixon. Even by Nixon's own acknowledgement, the day he left the presidency, he said, if you hate your enemies, you destroy yourself. And he has acknowledged in his memoirs what happened, and then we have this voluminous record of crime, Nixon's own tape recordings. We have the testimony of his closest aides, not just John Dean, but eventually all of Nixon's top aides, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, wrote books and provided testimony that the president initiated crimes or engaged in criminal activity. So I don't believe that that is the case. Since Watergate, obviously presidents have been scrutinized much more intensely. Part of the point of this book is the presidents don't like that, and instead of accepting the new world that we live in, I would not agree with the caller that the press or the media is the first estate. We are still the fourth or the fifth or the ninth, but we have a role, and it is, if you chart all of these scandals and investigations, at the core of all of them is the behavior of the presidents.
You recall in your book the background of how the phrase, "My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over," said by Richard Nixon on the day that he resigned, how that got into the speech.
No, it was said by Gerald Ford.
I'm sorry,
yes,
yes. By Gerald Ford.
Right.
Exactly.
Nixon was saying the long national nightmare just begins because
right.
he was going into exile,
right,
and no longer had the presidency, and then conducted a 20-year war with history to a certain extent to say, oh no, it really didn't happen, and so forth. But Ford, the long national nightmare, our long national nightmare is over, his statement was such a relief to people when he assumed the presidency. And Bob Hartman, his speechwriter, wrote that in the middle of the night and handed Ford the speech draft, and Ford liked everything except that line. And Ford said to Hartman, Don't you think that's a little hard on Dick, meaning Nixon? And Hartman begged and pleaded and said it will be the only thing you will ever be remembered for, or it will be the lead item on television in every newspaper story. And Ford finally did include that, and it's one of the two quotes that Gerald Ford has in Bartlett's familiar quotations, I believe.
What's the other one? Do you know?
Not a Lincoln, but a Ford.
Santa Cruz, California, you're next with Bob Woodward. Hello.
Hello, thank you for taking my phone call. The question is somewhat technical, I guess. How do you view the difference between nonfiction and fiction? You know, you can't possibly know all the facts in every single thing that you investigate. But I'm wondering what the difference is between what you do and what someone like Don DeLillo does in Libra, for example.
Okay,
Libra was about Lee Harvey Oswald, as you recall.
Certainly. I mean, there's a vast difference. Everything in this book is reported based on interviews, documents. I had 3 years, really, to work on it, and there is a basis for everything, a sound basis, the soundest basis I could get. Is it perfect? Is it like a movie of everything that went on in the White House all of these years? Absolutely not. But it is exhaustively and comprehensively reported. Is it perfect? No. I've had, since the book has come out, a couple of people have called me with disagreements or complaints. I spelled somebody's name wrong. There is a date wrong, and somebody seriously questions one sentence, a minor character in the book. I have the evidence that I put in the book. If I get new evidence or better evidence, then I will change it. But it is not any of it made up or fictionalized or changed or made more dramatic or less dramatic than it was.
Page 364 of your book, you have a conversation going on between President Clinton and Vernon Jordan. About Monica Lewinsky. Vernon Jordan asked President Clinton, quote, "You aren't boffing this kid, are you?" How do you do dialogue, first of all, and how did you know that he used those words?
First of all, Vernon Jordan testified before the grand jury on that, and he gave a different answer. In the course of the investigation, there are lots of lawyers working on the case, debriefing clients even before they go to the grand jury. And a smart lawyer, team of lawyers in any case, before somebody goes to the grand jury, will ask all of the obvious questions. And that comes from that record and people who know that. And it is a little different than his grand jury testimony in terms of language, but it is consistent, and it was, in fact, made earlier in time, and it was much more contemporaneous to the events.
This email in, Mr. Woodward, why should we believe that your book Shadow is factual when Mrs. Casey and her daughter denied that you were in the hospital room getting info from a dying man when you wrote the book on Casey?
This is the book Veil I did
Right.
in 1987. Mrs. Casey and her daughter did deny that I was there. They were not there. Journalists have extensively examined that and established that there were periods that they were not in the hospital. And Mrs. Casey, a very nice and fine woman, somebody I got to know quite extensively when I was doing the book on her husband, Bill Casey, who was the CIA director for Reagan, took the position when the book came out that I had never talked to Casey. Well, there are records in the CIA which have since been released. All kinds of people know I talked to Casey, and finally, sadly, in one television show, Mrs. Casey was taking this position that I had never interviewed her husband. I reminded her on live television that she had served breakfast to her husband and me in their house. To her credit and her honesty, said, "Oh yes, I remember that."
Native of Geneva, Illinois. Our guest is Bob Woodward. Where's Geneva?
That's where I was born,
Right.
Geneva, Illinois. I was raised in Wheaton, Illinois.
Next call, Charlotte, North Carolina.
Oh, hello, Mr. Woodward. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I have two questions. I'm dying to read your book, but I'm visually impaired. Is it coming out in audiobook?
It already, Simon & Schuster has an audio version of this out already, which is an extent, it's not the whole book, but it is
right.
a very sophisticated, I think it's many more hours than normally audio books are.
Did you record it?
No, I did. I recorded the introduction, which is very brief, and then somebody who can speak much more clearly and rapidly and better than I did the actual text.
Las Vegas, you're next.
Hello.
Hi, you're on the air, ma'am.
Mr. Woodward, it is my pleasure to speak to you. I watched every minute of the Watergate trial, and I have a question. How is it possible? I'm reading Betrayal by Bill Gertz, how the Clinton administration, I bought that book yesterday, how the Clinton administration undermined American security. But how is it possible that Gerald Ford, I'm from Michigan, I can't stand the man. How could Gerald Ford grant a pardon to Richard Nixon when he wasn't even indicted or admittedly found guilty? Okay, I don't understand.
Under the law, the pardon power a president has, which is written into the Constitution, can be granted before any indictment or charge has been brought, and there are court cases, and there is a tradition of that. For instance, when I believe it was Jimmy Carter pardoned all the draft dodgers, they hadn't been indicted or charged and so forth. Technically, the president could, under the Constitution, I don't think it would work very well, pardon everyone in this country for every crime they committed or might have committed.
The dedication. Who's it to?
To my two daughters, Tally, who lives in San Francisco, who's 22 now and working for the San Francisco Bay Guardian as a reporter and writing stories herself. She just recently graduated from Berkeley. And my daughter Diana, who will be 3 in August, who is not yet a reporter, but has the curiosity of 10.
Is Diana upset that Dad is not spending Father's Day with her?
No, she's making pancakes for me, and I'll eat them when I get home.
Next is Wilmington, Delaware.
Hello.
You're on the air. Go ahead, sir.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you for taking my call. I was wondering, Mr. Woodward, I got your book today for a Father's Day gift, and before I begin to read it, what exactly do you feel is the legacy of Watergate? And explain the choice of the title Shadow in terms of how that might summarize or if you will, summarize what your feelings are about the legacy, and any advice to the reader before I start to read it.
Before he cracks it, huh?
Sorry for so many questions.
That's a great question, a little primer. Hopefully the introduction, which is very short, was suggested by somebody at Simon & Schuster that I need to lay out exactly the questions you ask, and I attempt to answer them here. Exactly what the book is. Broadly, the goal is to look at these presidents and get as close to the real life they are living and examine how they've responded to investigations, inquiries, and trouble. And what I found is they respond very emotionally. They don't like it. To a certain extent, all of them did not learn the obvious lesson of Watergate, and that is when there's trouble or scandal or investigations, don't let it drag on. End it. Solve the problem by being candid, straight talk. There's nothing better than straight talk in American politics, not ducking and dodging and this language of it depends on the definition of what is, or I didn't inhale, flat-out denials when things are going to come out, whether the next day or the next week or in the historical record, just make no sense.
We talked about Gerald Ford. Move on to Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter, of course, is a Watergate baby. Became president because of Watergate and promised never to lie. In fairness to him, he was not ever seriously accused of any criminal activity himself. But when some of his aides, like Burt Lance, got in trouble, his budget director, it turns out that Lance came to Carter in advance and said, before any of the banking allegations surfaced, and said, I've got trouble, I need to resign, I'll go back to Georgia, where they were both from, and I will fix these matters, and then I'll come back. And Carter would not hear of it. And you see in the Carter presidency this tendency to be overly self-righteous, to feel somewhat that the rules don't apply to some of the people around him. At the same time, the first independent counsel investigation took place in the Carter administration by Arthur Christie, who was the first of many independent counsels, and he was charged with investigating White House Chief of Staff under Carter, Hamilton Jordan, to investigate allegations that Jordan had taken cocaine at a nightclub in New York City, Studio 54. It turns out that there was zero evidence against Jordan. I had a young reporter at the Washington Post who read this and said, I always thought those allegations were true. In fact, Jordan was cleared, but the way the process works, you're cleared, which is we're not going to charge you, and it's done in a way of, well, maybe we couldn't prove it, maybe the evidence wasn't that good. It turns out when you get into the records of the independent counsels, some of which are available, and my assistant Jeff Glasser was able to read through them, get copies, you discover that there were allegations, they were totally trumped up, and there was zero, absolutely zero evidence. And here is somebody, Hamilton Jordan, who was wronged by the process, seriously wronged.
If you can't get in by telephone today and you would like to join our discussion, you can do it by email if you like. That address is booktv@cspan.org. Next phone call, Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Hello.
Hi. I don't think Bob understood the question of an earlier caller, that she wasn't, I don't think, talking so much about Clinton's involvement with these women, but the willingness, the systematic willingness of these, of Clinton and Hillary to trash and destroy all the women who were, in fact, telling the truth about him. That I find one of the most despicable things about both Mr. and Mrs. Clinton. And the other thing I want to ask Bob about is Janet Reno's role. My mind just won't set up the pins as to how she would allow Clinton administration and all of his pit bulls to destroy Ken Starr, who was in effect really doing the bidding supposedly of the Justice Department. I just still don't understand her whole role in this whole thing.
Okay, well, I mean, those are interesting questions, and you have it's very clear the position you take on them. In fact, when you look at the evidence and you attempt to do that neutrally, you see that it's not at all clear that a lot of these women who made allegations against Clinton were telling the truth. There is anywhere from some doubt to a lot of doubt on a number of them. At the same time, Jennifer Flowers, President Clinton, acknowledged that he had that relationship once back in the 70s. Monica Lewinsky, we now know that that is true, but some of the others there are big questions about. Now, the very interesting question of the Attorney General's role in this, Janet Reno, she in fact did not appoint Ken Starr. A three-judge panel under the law makes the appointment. She under the law, Janet Reno could remove Starr for misconduct. She obviously has not done that. And in the book, I believe I present the two faces of Ken Starr, if you will, that you can see many times that he had legitimate beefs with the cooperation of the White House, was attempting to get to the bottom of things. There particularly is a period in January '96 when new evidence kind of comes in very quickly, a memo tying Mrs. Clinton directly to the billing records, to the travel office firings. Second, the discovery of the billing records in the White House and the distress that Starr and his deputies legitimately felt. Hey, are we being stonewalled? Is there a cover-up going on here? Do we have a mechanism for getting good information? At the same time, when it came to the Lewinsky probe, there are even people who worked with Starr who felt he was too aggressive, or in the handling particularly of the referral and some of the sequence there, the report that was sent to Congress about Monica Lewinsky, that he made some serious misjudgments.
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Hello.
Thank you, C-SPAN. What I have is, it's not a question, but perhaps an observation, and it has to do with the Nixon pardon. I've always argued that up until the pardon, everything had worked. The Constitution had, it had functioned the way it was designed. We'd gotten rid of a poor leader, if you will. And then when Ford pardoned Nixon with no trial, with no charges or anything, it was a kingly act, if you will. And then the Supreme Court seemed to rubber stamp it. It seems like the American people kind of lost faith in the system from that point on.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting way you put all that together. Of course, the Constitution gives the president the power to grant that pardon. And Ford makes the argument in the book, and made it at the time, and I believe I've expanded on it with some interviews with former President Ford. Ford said he did this to get for the country, not really that much for Nixon, but that the country needed to get beyond Watergate, that the possibility that Nixon would be charged and put on trial and maybe go to jail would absorb so much attention for months and years of the country that he had to short-circuit it. As I look at it now, historically, I think Ford was right to pardon Nixon. I think he totally blew it in terms of the way he handled it and failed to explain it, and he made it look like he, as one of his aides joked, that if he went on television early Sunday morning and announced it, no one would notice.
Indianapolis, hello.
Hello. Please allow me to introduce myself. Hello, Bob.
Yes.
It's been about 28 years. Feels like only a couple of weeks. My name is Pede Teoroot. I would like to ask you about the title shadow and about the identity.
So somebody else did too. I'm sorry I didn't answer that.
I'd like to ask you about the title of Deep Throat and about the identity of Deep Throat. As I remember, that's all you've seen was a low definition or high definition shadow. Since that is all you've seen, is there any connection to the title of your book? Thank you.
Okay. Deep Throat is the name the managing editor of the Washington Post at the time of Watergate gave to one of our sources who provided information about what went on in the Nixon White House. And the connection to Shadow as a title for this book, none exists that I know of.
What do you think about all of the reaction that you've had over the past week? When did this book actually hit the bookstores?
Let's see, I think about 5 or 6 days ago.
Since then, there's been a lot of reaction in Washington, I don't know about around the country, but about your sourcing. And in fact, in the New Republic this coming week, the whole TRB column is dedicated to what they're calling Deep Throat 2. What do you think about all these questions?
Well, I mean, this is very detailed information which has not been challenged about what happened and what went on. I have tried to approach this as somebody attempting a serious history of what the legacy is, and lots of people were willing to help me. And I think what's of more interest and of more significance is the information rather than the sources. But I understand the curiosity, and people are, it's reasonable for them to ask any questions.
It has been written that this is the first time you've had footnotes in any of your books. Is that true?
No. In the book I did on John Belushi, the comedian, and his drug death, I had notes at the end, but there are 50 pages of notes at the end of this book.
Did that take you a lot more time to footnote all this?
My assistant, Jeff Glasser, who's now about 25, worked for me full-time on this, and he did the notes based on the sources we had, and he's really the one who did these.
Is Jeff Glasser any relation to Susan Glasser, who works at the Washington Post?
That's correct. They are brother and sister. But I hired Jeff to work for me. He does not work for the Washington Post before Susan came to work at the Post.
Palm Desert, California, you're next. Hello. Hello, Palm Desert.
Yes, hello. Happy Father's Day. I'm wondering if you've read the book as is written, Silent Coup, and if you could talk about your naval career and how that might relate to your sourcing and how that's never seems to be brought up and your positioning with the government and how it may relate to your future, your writing and how it your sources it might be tied to. Or
caller, why don't you tell us what Silent Coup is?
It's been probably 7 years since I wrote it. It was on the...
You wrote it or read it?
No, I read it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said I wrote it. Didn't you?
All of us, you were going to take more interest, huh?
No. I read it 7 years ago. I forget the author. I apologize. Silent Coup was on the Nixon administration and the, Watergate affair, and it had some interesting... it was my first real reading on... I didn't read All the President's Men, or I'm born in 1966. But I found it pretty interesting the way it portrayed the Watergate affair and how it attributed certain causes and effects and the players. I don't know how much notoriety it's been given, but I guess it's been some years, and every time I see your name or Watergate, I always kind of think of the interplay and that you did have a naval career and were in naval intelligence or how...
No, I was not in naval intelligence. People have said that. The book Silent Coup is a book I really disagree with, and when you look at the record that has since come out, it posits that somehow Watergate was about a call girl ring and not about the abuses in the White House. And it has a chapter on me which is heavy on speculation and very thin on fact, and tries to intimate without saying it and without providing any evidence that somehow I got information from Al Haig about Watergate in the period Carl and I were writing stories for the Post. That's just not true, and if you look at the record and look at what Haig knew and what he was doing, I believe he was over in the Pentagon at that time or working on national security in the White House. Those authors, their two authors, had their shot in that book, and I think it's been pretty much thoroughly discredited.
If you're watching us live on this Sunday afternoon, in about 45 minutes, we'll be joined by Cal Thomas. He and Ed Dobson have written this new book called Blinded by Might, which is about the Christian right. What's your thoughts about what the Christian right's impact has been in the last 25 years?
It's been significant. I know Cal Thomas and have a lot of respect for him. I find him to be an interesting man who is an ideologue and is very upfront about it. I got to know him when David Broder and I were doing a series on Dan Quayle back in 1991, 1992, and I always found Cal Thomas direct and thoughtful, and he labeled himself where he was coming from.
Plantation, Florida, you're next. Hello.
Mr. Woodward, you used the word and castigated a woman for not being neutral in her feelings toward the Clintons. And I hardly find you neutral. I find it laughable to think of you as neutral. And I'm interested in knowing
I'm going to puzzle you. When you say that, I'm not sure whether you're going to say I'm pro-Clinton or anti-Clinton.
Well, I'm very positively saying that you're pro-Clinton, and this is my point. When did you know that several of those Democratic senators were going to go to Mr. Clinton to ask him to step down? When was it that you knew that?
That's a fair question. It was after the... It's not that they were going to go, ma'am. It's that they were talking about going, that there was anger. This is back in September of '98 when it occurred. I did not learn about it until after the impeachment trial was over in February. Pro-Clinton, anti-Clinton, George Stephanopoulos reports in his book some of the comments that Clinton made about me, which I don't think I really want to repeat, and I suspect because of the detail laid out about possible additional woman in Clinton's life, which I talk about in this book, and the fear that Clinton and his lawyers had that Clinton was going to be asked about this woman in the Paula Jones case and the portrayal of some of the agony and so forth. I doubt if Clinton will be giving a blurb for the book.
San Jose, California, you're next.
Thank you for taking my question.
Certainly.
This is Masood Alavi from San Jose, and I've written a few pieces about the abuse of the fourth estate or the press and the glamour people in the press who runs the powers that be. My question to you, Mr. Woodward, is this. Have you considered doing an expose of the major figures in the media who determine what stories go on become the main stories in the newspapers and the networks? All of this last year, there were stories like the nuclear, face-off in the Middle East or the subcontinent and the Bosnia story. But the powers that be chose the Monica Lewinsky story to be the main story. And if that was a proper use of the the airwaves and the newspapers. Have you ever considered doing a story maybe of the kinds that you have done on the presidents, on the powers that run the media?
Thanks, Senator.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, but I think when you go back and look at the Lewinsky scandal and the performance of the press, the daily press and television and so forth, some organizations got overheated and some things were said that were overheated plus. But when you look basically at the performance, particularly of the print media, the Washington Post where I work, they were very careful. They broke lots of information. It was a serious issue about whether the president was telling the truth, whether he had lied under oath, whether he had obstructed justice. Certainly the Congress and the Senate felt it was, that we had an impeachment and a trial. I can't imagine how you don't cover that story.
What is your next book?
Don't know. I have no idea.
Haven't started it yet?
No, absolutely.
How do you
How could I?
How do you go about? When was the last word written in this?
That's probably April.
Of this year?
April. Yeah.
So just
April.
a couple months.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Sure. A rush to publication?
Well, no, I hope not a rush. I mean, a thoughtful, accelerated effort.
Sometimes it takes a year after the book is finished.
But we felt we could get this done, and my editor, Alice Mayhew, worked on it diligently, and so there was no rush.
As you look down at this list of all of the books that you've written, what's your favorite?
Well, I'm going to give the answer that most authors and fathers give, which is that you love all your children.
St. Louis, Missouri, you're next.
Thank you for taking my call. George Bush always said he was out of the loop on Iran-Contra, and I was wondering what you found out about that. And what is your opinion on the governor of Minnesota, Jesse Ventura?
I'll start with the last question about Governor Ventura. I do not know him and have just watched and read occasionally about him, and so I really don't have an opinion. I do deal in the section on President George Bush in the book, 50 or 60 page section about Bush's dealing with scandal and his anger and bitterness about it, and also deal with the Iran-Contra role that he had. I think there was no evidence that he was criminally involved, but again, thematically, he failed to be straight and direct at points when he could have answered questions much more succinctly.
This is the cover of the Washington Post magazine coming out today. They pulled out a part of the book, excerpted a part of the book from this.
Yes, that's right. That is.
Why this part?
Well, we did 3 sections of the book last week on Clinton, and the editor of the magazine, Glenn Frankel, looked through it, and the managing editor and the editor of the paper, and said this is a part that is a whole and really is a fresh look at the Bush presidency and how he handled his tangle with scandal. And quite frankly, it's the authentic voice of George Bush, because I got some diary entries that he made in his diary. He wrote me a letter, they're behind-the-scenes conversations, and you see his distress at the scandal culture. You see his anger and frustration, and in a sense that he had paid a tremendous price personally for being president because of all of these questions about his son, Neil Bush, about Iran-Contra, about some of those closest to him, people like John Tower, the former senator that Bush wanted to be his Secretary of Defense, who was rejected by the Senate. And Bush himself wrote me a letter in which he talks about Washington, D.C. being Dodge City, and Bush says he's going to stay out of Dodge.
Did you, did this picture, is this a picture specifically for this magazine?
No. He
didn't talk to you?
He did not talk to me, and his letter is his reasoning, it was a very, he shows his bitterness, but at the same time, in classic Bush fashion, he says, I know in the end, I should almost read it here, I'd have to put my glasses on to do it, but in essence, at the end, he says, I'm going to stay out of Dodge, and expresses his bitterness, and then he says, even though I won't participate, I wish you well, and I hope you don't think I'm a hypocrite by wishing you well, but I do.
Which of these presidents talked to you for this book specifically?
Ford and Carter, and Reagan cannot, and Clinton would not.
Boulevard, California, you're next.
Hi. Bob, I want to get your read on this. I'll try to very briefly describe this to you. When Oliver North was in his testimony before Congress, time and time again, he refused to answer questions relating to our policies in South America. It seemed to me that the government and North sanctioned this, that for reasons of national security, he could not discuss certain issues relating to our policies in South America. Consequently, the United States, or the people of the United States, were never able to find out in depth the conspiracy of the presidency. Now, it seems to me the conspiracy of the presidency usurping the Constitution is a far, far more grave national security issue than our behavior in South America. So it seems, and it looks to me on the surface, that the United States government acted in a conspiratorial way to avoid an impeachment, to avoid an airing out and a finding of facts that the United States government was usurped by the president in the name of national security, which is a much less grave issue in terms of our policies in South America than the action of our president, and everything was whitewashed.
Well, this has to do, I guess, with Iran-Contra and the war, the CIA war to overthrow the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua and other CIA activities there. When you look at the record now, a lot of people agree with you and think that Iran-Contra was in fact much more serious than even Watergate. I would seriously argue with that. I think things came off the tracks in Iran-Contra. Interestingly enough, it was President Reagan who, after stonewalling and not being forthright for months, finally brought in Howard Baker to clean house and conduct an investigation of some depth, and really kind of said, hey, look at what went on. I'm just looking at the pictures myself of it's Howard Baker, who is the Republican leader who wanted to be president himself, ran or thought of running a couple of times, who was the minority, kind of the vice chairman of the Senate Watergate Committee that investigated Nixon, and a team of lawyers, A.B. Culverhouse and Bill Litton, who, and I was able to get records and do interviews with them, and you see that there was no evidence of crimes. Now, that doesn't mean crimes weren't committed, but no one was able to find evidence. And Howard Baker told Reagan and told the lawyers, look, if I uncover something incriminating, I'm not going to go the cover-up route. I am going to disclose it. And so in a sense, it was an in-house investigation unlike I think we've ever seen since Watergate in the White House.
Darien, Georgia, hello.
Yes, ma'am, I have a statement and a question. The evident to us, my wife and I, that the liberals like you, Mr. Woodward, and Mr. George Stephanopoulos will only sell their criticism of the Clinton administration. Now the question, why during the impeachment you state that there was dissension in the Democratic Party? Why did the liberal media and you sit on this information as opposed to jumping on Nixon during the Watergate affair?
Okay, that's a fair question, but the dissension and the distress, as I outline in the book, occurred in September of '98, and the Democratic senators were talking to themselves. I was only able to confirm this after the trial and put it in the book. Believe me, if I knew that a number of senators were about to go call for the president's resignation, the Democratic senators, at the time, I would have found a way to get that in the newspaper, and it certainly would have been news that should come out at that time.
An email from Jerry Bartley in Mount Pleasant, Texas. He asked, Mr. Woodward, after all of the publicity on the 80-odd ethics charges against Newt Gingrich, and only one with any credibility, the IRS cleared him of any tax law violation. Do you sense an imbalance of coverage on first the charges and second the eventual outcome?
On the Gingrich, matters,
on the ethics charges.
Well, those were serious, and you have to cover them. And here is the problem the journalist faces. You go to work in the morning, and you've got a tip or something's happened, there's an investigation, and you have a cycle. The Washington Post, it's 24 hours to put out the best version that you can get of what's occurring. You don't know where it's going. You don't know what it means. The Watergate burglary, I'd worked for the Washington Post for 9 months, and I was assigned the story because everyone thought it was ridiculous. They agreed with Nixon's spokesman, Ron Ziegler, that it was a third-rate burglary. When I say everyone, a lot of people. There were editors and owners and people at the Post who said, well, look, we're going to take a serious look. I remember Howard Simons, the managing editor of the Washington Post at that time, a truly wonderful person, aggressive editor, calling us in and said, what's happening on Watergate? I want to know. When you get the Gingrich case or the Clinton case or any matter that surfaces, you don't know. And so you put out the best version each day, or sometimes on 24-hour television, the best version, which often is not very good, every 10 minutes. But that's the way you function, and the ethics of the Speaker of the House, somebody so visible and powerful, the ethics and conduct of the President of the United States in the same category, they need to be scrutinized.
Houston, Texas, you're next. Hello.
Yes, I'd like to know Mr. Woodward's impressions about Henry Kissinger, and are we gonna is Deep Throat gonna have to be dead before he lets us know who Deep Throat is?
That is correct. Or when I'm released by the source named Deep Throat to release his identity, which I would love to do because it would be a very good story. It's unrelated to Henry Kissinger. Kissinger is one of these figures of history who does not go away. He recently published a book about his third volume of his memoirs, Service during the Ford Presidency. It's a fascinating account. Lots of people have truth squatted it and argue with Kissinger. I even found one scene in Volume 2 and Volume 3, the exact same scene with different quotes, not of substance, but literally different quotes. So he's a figure who looms large even today, and to a certain extent, Kissinger's one of the legacies of Watergate, if you will, because, as he says in his recent book, the Watergate scandal meant that President Nixon was almost incapacitated and certainly consumed by this, and that gave Kissinger, in his role as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, virtual autonomy in running foreign policy for the country for a great many months, if not years.
Phoenix, hello.
Hi, how you doing?
Great.
Question for Mr. Woodward. Actually, two questions. Your next book, could you possibly think about doing the Chinese money connection to the Clinton administration and the selling of our national security down the drain? And secondly, what did you think of Al Gore's response to your saying that he said certain things regarding President Clinton? Trying to think specifically, it was on the Larry King show, and was asked specifically about the quote. I think you quoted him in the book of what he said to President Clinton at the meeting with the cabinet members, that he was very disappointed, had to get his act together, and he denied it explicitly.
That's not a quote in my book. That was a quote someplace else. I don't know exactly where that came from, but that indeed was not something that is in my book, believe me. What was the first part of the question?
First part of the question was doing the Chinese angle in your next book. You know you're going to get suggestions for your next book, and you can...
well, I'm really happy to get lots of suggestions. Richard Snyder, who used to be the CEO of Simon & Schuster, called me the other day and suggested exactly that subject, and others have. Back in '97, I and then another reporter at the Washington Post, Brian Duffy, who now works for U.S. News and World Report, did stories about the allegations of Chinese money in the elections and what had gone on there. It is the murkiest subject because it involves intelligence sources, and there was a lot there, and quite frankly, I could never get to the bottom of it.
Simon & Schuster is commemorating its 75th anniversary. Have they been a publisher of all your books?
Yes, they have.
I know you mentioned Alice Mayhew earlier, the vice president and also the editorial director at Simon & Schuster. You quote in your acknowledgments, "She rekindled my interest in presidents." Does that mean that your interest in presidents needed to be rekindled in order to do this book?
What I believe it says is that she rekindled my interest in presidents that I had covered.
That's right.
and written about. And in fact, she did. I kind of wondered whether replowing the ground would yield that much. What I had, besides time, is that memoirs have been written, there are documents available. These people were willing to be interviewed and re-interviewed in most cases. So in a sense, you can interrogate history and say, okay, what really happened? If I may, in the case of President Ford and the pardon, I pushed him on the question, why didn't you get an admission from Richard Nixon that he committed crimes crimes. That the clearest criticism on that pardon, other than it looked funny in the timing and the explanation and so forth, is that you had all the cards, Gerald Ford. You were president. You were willing to grant a pardon. Nixon was willing to accept it. If he didn't get this pardon, he was going to be investigated, maybe even indicted, and God knows tried. A former president sitting there in the dock. Why didn't you extract a confession? And Ford reached in his pocket as his last man, pulled out his wallet, and said, I have a quotation when I'm challenged about this from the Supreme Court decision that says, it's the verdict case, that says if you accept a pardon, you are admitting, you are acknowledging guilt. And he took this piece of paper out, and it was all worn, and he read it, and he said, that gives me great comfort to know that in a technical legal sense, by accepting the pardon, Nixon admitted guilt. In the forum of history and in the forum of public relations then and now, no one looks at that technicality as an admission of guilt. But that was Ford's answer. I don't know whether you certainly don't get that answer a year after he's left the presidency, or 2 years, or maybe even 10 or 15 years. But Gerald Ford, to his credit, is a man who's relaxed, feels comfortable with himself, feels comfortable with what he did as president, is not hiding, as best I can tell. And so in a way you can go and say, what really happened here? What do you feel? And why did you do it?
Where did you interview Mr. Ford?
Once in New York, once by telephone, and then once in California at his home, where he has an office on an afternoon where you had a sense he would stay there all day and all night to answer questions. He's not in a hurry. And he may not like some of my conclusions, but he gets his say.
Caller brought up Larry King. You also thank Larry King in your acknowledgments. Why?
Well, during the Lewinsky scandal and so forth, he had me on his show many times, and he has a group of producers who really follow the news, and as I was writing this book, it helped keep me current with what was going on that day or that week, and the contact with the Post and with them, and then kind of trying to interrogate history and trying to find out what went on behind the scenes was one of my points of comfort and information.
And you were doing this from Edgewater, Maryland?
Yes, yes.
Silver Spring, Maryland, you're next. Hello.
Yes, hello. Good afternoon, Mr. Woodward.
Hello.
I have a question / comment for you. I'm a bit surprised at your acceptance of Mr. Ford's pardon of President Nixon, because I'm quoting Article 2, Section 2 here of the Constitution, referring to the President, he shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States except in the cases of impeachment. Since this was an investigation leading towards impeachment at the time, how is it that President Ford had the legal authority under the Constitution to pardon him?
First of all, the reference to impeachment there means that a president cannot stop an impeachment of himself or somebody else while it's in process. When Ford granted the pardon of Nixon, Ford was president, not Nixon. The impeachment matter was moot, over. Nixon had resigned, so there was no impeachment issue. The impeachment investigation, in fact, had closed down because it had no relevance. As Richard Nixon said in his resignation announcement the day before he left office, he said, I, in effect, have impeached myself by resigning.
Doylestown, Pennsylvania, hello.
Yes, I have a question. Larry Klayman said this morning on C-SPAN, it was a rebroadcast of a Friday meeting with college students, that the 900 FBI files were put in the White House computer and used to blackmail senators during the impeachment trial. I think this obstruction by the Clinton administration is much worse than anything Nixon ever did. I think Nixon attempted to take IRS files, but he never went through with this. But Clinton actually has used the IRS.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure exactly what Larry Klayman said. He is head of Judicial Watch and has conducted a very aggressive, in the eyes of some, overly aggressive but permissible investigation through civil suits of the Clinton administration. I think the FBI files matter is truly a serious matter, but it's Ken Starr, in his own in-depth investigation of it, who has established that the files were not used, and that neither of that he has no evidence, as I understand it, that either of the Clintons used any of this. So I truly question that. If there is evidence that those FBI files were used to blackmail senators during the impeachment trial, that would be a major, incredible story. I just have seen no evidence at this point.
This email from Robert Lehman. Do you believe, or does your book address the allegations that Clinton ordered the military missile attacks in the Sudan and Afghanistan to solely divert attention from the impeachment?
I did look into that, and there's no evidence that I was able to obtain at all that those military attacks took place to divert attention. That is just not so. And I think there are people in charge of our military, particularly Secretary Cohen, who would not permit something like that.
That's the second part of the question. What about Secretary Conan's complicity therein? This would also apply to the initial bombing in Kosovo.
There is no evidence of that. I do have in the book a scene in which Secretary Cohen, while impeachment is about, the debate in the House of Representatives is about to start in December, where the military has recommended this 70-hour bombing attack on Iraq, and Secretary Cohen did tell the president that he and the national security team that works for Clinton felt very strongly that we had to go through with this bombing, and for certain technical reasons, when Ramadan was, where forces were, that there was a window of opportunity, and Secretary Cohen in effect told the president, if you don't do this now. Now remember, we had done it a little bit, but bombed Iraq because of the failure on weapons inspections, but we really, not a serious bombing campaign, and I'm sorry, we had started a bombing campaign a month or two earlier, and the planes were actually called back. And so Secretary Cohen told the president, if you don't do it now, the next argument is going to be that you're paralyzed.
This one from Belinda Griffin in Stockton, California. As someone who did not vote for Jimmy Carter, I'm struck by his endeavors since leaving the presidency. He seems to be the only ex-president that has openly reflected on his failures as well as successes. He seems to be the only one who has really captured the citizen-politician demeanor. What's your comment?
Yeah, I think Jimmy Carter deserves an immense amount of credit for what he has done as former president. When I went down to interview him at the Carter Center in Atlanta, going in, I thought, well, okay, this is the Carter Center. It's going to be dead here. There's no action, nothing going on. Everyone's running around. You can tell by the demeanor and the tone of people that they're working hard on these issues. And I think you can argue that Jimmy Carter has saved thousands, tens of thousands, maybe more lives by what he has done through that center and his work since leaving the presidency. I would still argue, with all of that respect for his work after the time he served in the White House, as president, the sense, the necessity for straight, and direct talk on some of these questions was not sufficient and caused him difficulty as president.
How long did you spend with him?
Oh, I don't know, maybe an hour or so, but I then talked to all kinds of people who worked for him and, in fact, sent them a draft of a section of the book, which I did not do in any other case, to see if they wanted to comment, and Jody Powell, as press secretary, had some comments, and President Carter
Why did you
not.
choose those people?
Because it involved a meeting that Ben Bradley and I had with President Carter about a CIA story, which is laid out in the book, about the payments that King Hussein was giving.
Next is San Francisco. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for taking the call. Mr. Woodward, I've heard some other people mentioning silent coup and so forth, and I thought it'd be good if we could come to some resolution as to who's telling the truth. So I came up with an idea, which would be that I'd be glad to wager you $5,000, and I'd give the money to charity if I won, that you cannot pass a polygraph test on 2 questions. The first would be that, according to silent coup, John Dean was more responsible for the break-in than Nixon. Your book would indicate it was Nixon. That would be the first one. The second one would be that you claim to have interviewed Bill Casey when he's near death in the hospital, when everyone else involved said that you weren't there. Would you accept that?
You know, that's a fascinating and challenging idea. I just don't think that polygraphs. Bill Safire, the columnist at the New York Times, has written extensively about this, are a way to establish truth. The truth about Watergate is in the historical records and in the Nixon tapes, and the idea that John Dean is responsible for Watergate, when I really urge you don't have to talk to me or take my word. Go to the National Archives and strap on the headphones and listen to the Nixon tapes, read the transcripts of, some come out almost each month. And it is a chilling, horrifying story about abuse of power on many levels, not just Watergate. And the question of Casey, everyone pretty much agrees, and the point of my book about Casey was that he was kind of the orchestrator, the godfather, if you will, of the Iran-Contra diversion, or certainly knew about it, and I don't think anybody who's really looked at any of that, including my interviews with him, would seriously question that.
Are all of your books still in print?
I don't know what in print means.
Can someone go to a bookstore and pretty much either find it or order it?
It's some of the, yes. I think sometimes they're paperback and you have to order
That was my second question. Did they all come out in paperback at some point in time in the
yes,
future, except
yes,
for obviously
they have.
this one? And
Yes.
is there plans to bring this one out in paperback?
Yes, this one will come out in paperback.
When? Do you know?
Sometime next year, a year after now.
Marshall, North Carolina, you're next.
Hi, Mr. Woodward. I wondered if you'd ever come to any revised conclusions about what the Watergate burglars were really after in Democratic headquarters. Also, if you think it's possible that Hunt and McCord were continuing to work for the CIA but under White House cover.
You know, there are always new pieces of the puzzle that emerge. Sometimes they're moderately significant, sometimes just add a little more detail to it. But again, when you look at the record, and I would argue, and I've looked at a lot of it, and am willing to consider new pieces of evidence. For instance, when Gordon Liddy's book came out in the 70s, the book called Will, about his story and his role in Watergate, I wrote a review for the Washington Post and said some of the information in Liddy's book really does suggest that the CIA must have known more about what was going on with the Hunt-Liddy burglary team than they have acknowledged, for the simple reason that the so-called gemstone plan that Liddy brought to Attorney General Mitchell about the Watergate burglary, about various intelligence gathering activities, those plans were made by the CIA. They actually made kind of poster boards and so forth. Now, can you imagine somebody down in graphics at the CIA getting a plan with a code word for somebody working as for the White House or the Re-election Committee, and this is Gordon Liddy, and the kind of layout, actually part of the plan included hiring prostitutes to lure Democrats and so forth. Somebody in graphics at the CIA is getting this, actually drawing up a plan like this. You would think they might tell her boss, who might tell their boss, and it might get up somehow. Now, it's suggestive, not conclusive. It doesn't provide definitive evidence, but I think there were people in the CIA at one level or another who had a deeper understanding of what was going on. Whether they had criminal knowledge or not, I don't know.
5 minutes left with Bob Woodward. Petaluma, California's next. Hello.
Good afternoon. I wanted
this
to
is kind of an endurance
Pardon me?
Pardon? No, I'm sorry. This is a bit of an endurance contest. It's a 90
minutes. That's
non-stop.
Right. But you get pancakes when you're done at home, right?
Yeah, I hope.
There you go. My question is really, speaking of endurance contests, the endurance of writing a book of this scale and scope, and you've done 8 of them. I'm curious, really about the time that you have to put in on writing a book like this. Obviously, you probably have to take a leave of absence and other things, but I'm just curious about the mechanics of putting together a volume like this.
Well, it's not just the mechanics. You have to gather the material and do the interviews and figure out what you're going to exclude, because this, as I say in the introduction, is not a history of these presidencies. It is, in fact, not a history of all the scandals in all of the presidencies. It's a history of the scandals that had the most impact, personal and political, on the presidents and those around them. In other words, how they handled major trouble. I did not take a leave of absence. The Washington Post publishes excerpts from these books, and I do some editing and stories when something comes up, as I had talked about earlier, which the editors believe belongs in the paper right away. And I have a young assistant, in this case, Jeff Glasser, who carved out for himself, from my point of view, magnificently, a role, not just doing the footnotes, but checking things, going and looking in the libraries of the presidents, going out to California, to the Nixon Library even, going up to the Ford Library in Michigan, going to the Carter Library in Atlanta, and living there for days and looking for the documents that would give us clues about what to look at, how they related to the matters we were doing interviews on, and so forth.
Do you ever speak to journalism classes these days?
Yes, sometimes. Mm-hmm.
Do you walk in? You had mentioned earlier about Jeff Glasser being 25 years old, and the fact that this is the 25th anniversary, therefore wasn't even born, or just was born the same year as this came out. Do you ever find journalism students not knowing about all the president's men?
Sure, of course.
Does that surprise you?
No. I mean, why would... I mean, as you point out, they were not born. There have been some polls done about Watergate and what it was, and the numbers are astounding. A lot of people think it took place at the early part of the century, young people. It's very easy when you're not immersed in something to have misinformation.
Dallas, Texas, hello.
Hi, Mr. Woodward, I appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate your work. I just have a quick question about the passage of time. Is it possible that President Clinton might have been more likely to be removed or to resign 25 years ago, or that Mr. President Nixon might have remained in office today, or are the differences fundamentally different so that the results would have been the same?
Obviously, that's if history, and there's no knowing, but there are interesting interactions. Fred Thompson, the senator from Tennessee, who was one of those who voted on Clinton's impeachment, in deciding that he voted for the obstruction of justice, but against the perjury charge, as I recall. And Thompson was the minority counsel on the Senate Watergate committee. And so he had all of this experience. He had seen it, and he has made the point in his analysis that Watergate in part saved Clinton because the Watergate crimes were so clear. There were all the tapes, all the testimony, all the clear abuses of the FBI, the CIA, the IRS, and so forth, that Watergate raised the bar. Clinton's problems came along, and the feeling was, well, gee, there aren't tapes, there isn't this magnitude of abuse and scandal, and so Clinton got off because it seemed like a much lesser violation, and if Watergate had not existed as a backdrop, as a counterpoint, things might have come out differently for Clinton.
I went on Amazon.com right before coming down here and saw that your book is number 2 on how their books are selling right now, right after Hannibal by Tom Harris, the novel. How many have been printed?
Over 400,000.
And what are your expectations?
I mean, I have, my expectations are to answer questions about it and talk about it, and it is selling as well or better than any book I've done. And the Hannibal book is a fiction book, and this is seems to be selling better than any nonfiction book now out for the moment. And it's a history of an era, and it's not just dull history. There's a lot of emotion. All of these investigations and scandals strike at the core of the being of the men who've held the office.
This is the book, Shadow, 5 Presidents and the Legacy of Watergate by Bob Woodward, out just less than a week. You can find it in your bookstores. Thanks very much for spending the 90 minutes with us on Father's Day. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll be back in just a few moments. We're going to be joined by Cal Thomas. He has a new book out, co-authored with Ed Dobson, called Blinded by Might, Can the Religious Right Save America? We'll be opening up our phone lines and inviting you to join us for that.